Welcome to this special episode of the Hangar Z podcast, covering the 2025 LA Firestorm. This podcast is brought to you by Vertical Helicast and in partnership with Vertical Valor magazine. In this special episode, we talk with Hangar Z alumni, LA County Fire Pilot Mike Sagely, about the recent wildfire disaster that swept through Los Angeles. Mike's a dedicated LA County Fire Pilot on the front lines who will shed light on this urgent and devastating situation. Over this past week, the Palisades Fire erupted in the Pacific Palisades neighborhood of Los Angeles, growing rapidly to over 23,000 acres. Tragically, that fire has likely damaged or destroyed over 5,300 structures. Meanwhile, the Eaton Fire ignited near a canyon north of downtown Los Angeles, escalating to more than 14,000 acres and affecting more than 7,800 structures. These fires have reportedly already claimed the lives of at least 24 people. Join us as we unpack the aviation response to this devastating event and explore the incredible challenges firefighters faced battling wind and terrain-driven wildland fires. Mike will share invaluable insights on managing air operations under extreme weather conditions, from the critical forecasting and staffing adjustments made in anticipation of the fires to the complexities encountered during the initial attack and ongoing efforts. We'll discuss the emotional toll on firefighters, the vital role of mutual aid resources, and the strategic decision-making required to combat these wildfires effectively. Plus, hear about the impacts of drones on firefighting operations. Thank you to our sponsors, Metro Aviation, Robinson Helicopters, and Astronautics Corporation of America.
Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts. The Hangar Z podcast is the first and only podcast dedicated to promoting and exploring the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Join your host, John Gray, Jeff Ratkovich, and Jack Shanley.
Still southbound, skidding to a stop. Stand by here. Looks like they're getting ready to bail. Heads up, guys, bailing. Okay, the guy, he's running through the house, jumping the fence, through the shotgun, through something out. Grabbing the shotgun. Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again. He is armed. Stay there. Hold your position.
4 on the stop. You're in custody.
Good advising code 4 on the stop.
Hey, welcome to the Hangar Z podcast. I'm your host, John Gray, with you for a breaking news style podcast that we're recording with a podcast guest that you'll all be familiar with. We had the honor of recording with our guest at HAI this last year. He won the Pilot of the Year award from HAI, which is a big honor. We followed that up with another podcast recording talking about extreme fires in Southern California and kind of how the year-round fire season has kind of taken root in California. And here we are in January, just under a year later, talking to Mike again about their response to the wildfire disaster in Los Angeles. So, Mike, thanks for joining us, and thanks for all the efforts you've been putting into what's happening in LA.
Well, thank you. Before we get started, the community had just been incredible. They've obviously suffered. It's undescribable. I'm sure the news has been showing a lot. By far a career event for me and for most of the firefighters that are here, from what I understand, even our leadership that's been here, been in the department for, 30 years. The destruction, the personal loss is just, it's indescribable. And so we've been having people volunteer, bring in food, water. I mean, you name it. It's just amazing. They've got their own issues, their own concerns. And it's really, this is when you see the best of people, is when things are, really bad and they really seem to come together. I know there's some other not so good stuff on the news. Yeah. It's really been an honor, to be a part of it, to do my job, all of us here doing our job, and seeing the community, push through something that, quite frankly, I'm not, certain how some of them are going to, be able to handle it. But it's really something.
That's for sure. It's interesting. I feel like sometimes as a country and as a group of people, it takes the worst of circumstances to bring the best of people out.
Yep.
And you see that with what you guys are doing now as collectively as a fire department, and then collectively as a society too. I've seen tons of resources pop up, tons of fundraisers open up, trying to help people that are in need right now.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, I kind of want to set the scene for what's happening out there. And I'll start by saying I live about 60 miles northeast of LA in the mountains. So the winds that have been plaguing LA have also been plaguing my community. We're pretty sensitive to those types of weather events where we live because it has a potential impact on our daily lives as it knocks trees down and takes power out at our house and affects the commute and everything. So I received a text message from a friend of mine on January 5th, was a Sunday, warning us of this impending windstorm that was about to take place. And Southern California refer to those windstorms as the Santa Ana wind events. And typically they're winds out of the north, and they're typically very turbulent in nature from an aviation standpoint and very gusty. We get strong winds, often in excess of 60 knots and higher, coming through the Cajon Pass and into the LA Basin. So the text message I got was a warning from a CAL FIRE division chief, just saying, hey, that's not looking good for the mountains this next week. Looking at Santa Ana's sustained in the 60s with gusts up to 100 miles an hour. Haven't seen this type of wind event and fuel moisture event since 2017. Just a heads up. That was days before this took place. Mike, for you guys, you talked about some of the forecasting that went into play. Can you describe for our audience how that forecasting works and how it impacts your staffing?
Yeah, so we have what we call red flag staffing, and they're actually calling this purple flag, meaning even worse. But we watch the weather forecast well in advance, and as these events come up, the entire department starts adjusting their staffing needs accordingly with augmented staffing, strike teams on availability, all the camp crews, they're prepped as well. And we go into our augmented staffing, and we went even beyond our augmented staffing this time, and we've been manning 6 aircraft, basically our entire staff of pilots and crew members since day one. The interesting thing about the winds here, not only do they come out of the north, but they also channel in a few key areas. And sometimes they channel a little worse as you move east, and sometimes a little more when you move west. And typically they're a little bit more west than what we saw this time. And because of that, the San Gabriel area, Eaton Canyon, Altadena that got hit so hard, the winds were particularly bad in that area, much worse than what we generally see in a wind event. And if you look at where the Palisades Fire started, it kind of sits right in line with Newhall Pass. And these areas that channel the wind accelerate the wind through those passes. So you have localized winds in certain areas that are even more vicious than what would just be, say, the basic flow of the air and that wind as it moves into our area. So a lot of times that's kind of where you see the starts. It's not that they're predictable, but they can certainly be anticipated. And our augmented staffing is set. It's what we do all the time. And we bring in our maintenance staff, and we bring in all the pilots, and pretty much our entire staff has been here since day one.
Looking at this one event, of course, there was extreme winds that went with it. But this is late in the Santa Ana season. Now we've had 3 or 4 different Santa Ana wind events up to this point with little to no rain, almost no rain. In fact, they're saying this is the driest start to winter, the wet season in Southern California since 1850 is what I'm seeing. Are you seeing similar figures and information as to that, Mike?
Yeah, I saw something. I thought it was something like 1967, but either way, we've had 0.3 of an inch of rain.
Yeah.
So between those and the other part about those events, right, even though they may not cause fires, they still blow. They kind of aid in the drying of the fuel as well, right? So the fuel level moistures are exceptionally low. The humidity was not single-digit humidity, but still very low also. And then you throw in these areas that haven't had fires and they've got fuel growth in there for sometimes 50 or 60 years. I mean, you've got literally the perfect storm. Yeah. And that's kind of what we've seen specifically in the Palisades, not so much in Eaton. Eaton was just based on the fact that it was right down on the houses almost immediately within 5 minutes. So the impact on the houses and the community was almost instant. And therefore, obviously, trying to evacuate was extremely difficult to do.
Yeah.
And there was a huge mountain wave rollover there that was probably, well, the worst that I've experienced in my career. And I'll give you a couple of details, as we go into it. But from the flying standpoint, to the point where we couldn't fly for that period of time. Certainly in that area, I think they shut down eventually over on the Palisades, and then fortunately the next morning we were able to pretty much pick back up. But it still was pretty bad over there as well.
That says something, coming from somebody who's flown in all kinds of diverse environments, domestically and otherwise. So for you to say that is a huge statement. Can you talk about, so the listeners understand kind of the scale of what's happening in LA? Of course, everyone's seen the news and has seen a lot of the footage because it's world news at this point. But can you talk about the firefighting efforts in LA right now, what they look like, and in particular, what it looked like on that first day when the initial attack took place?
Yeah. So right now, the number of resources here and that are spread out are the biggest I've ever seen, bar none. And unfortunately, during this time of year, a lot of the contract aircraft are not necessarily here or in the region, right? They've kind of shut down for the year. They may be available for call when needed, but it takes time for them to gear up and get their aircraft, down to a helibase, get a helibase established, so on and so forth. They've got a helibase out at Brackett Airport in Pomona, or out by Pomona, Laverne, and then one at Camarillo. And then we have all the local agency bases, obviously, that have stood up. So we have private. We've got LA City, LA County, Orange County, Ventura County. The Guard, I think, is here now. Several. Well, you've seen the MAFs. You've seen the VLATs, the LATs. So all the CAL FIRE tankers. They've come from everywhere, here. So the resources, which is good because we have the second wind event, obviously starting today. So now we have a lot of resources in place that should make the IA, much more robust than it was, previously. The thing that I'd like to express, though, is with those conditions, realistically, assuming you could fly, this is the first time that I've been a part of ever shutting down the air as section of it, which was the first night. Even if you had double the aircraft that we had, Mother Nature, it's not going to stop it. It's just not. And then you're going to put a lot of people in serious risk just being out there. And there is a certain level of optics, and we all understand that, we don't like it. We don't like shutting down. It didn't come easy. The decision was not easy, but you have to make that calculated risk at some point. And, it's difficult. It's very difficult emotionally. I was Helco that night, and I'm up at 2,500 feet. So I've got a little space to work with when I'm getting, 1,500 foot per minute rates of descent, and I can't stop it. When these guys are down on the ground, or they're within a couple hundred feet of the ground, and they're going to actually drop water, and they tell me, and these are experienced guys, and they tell me that they can't do anything, I don't have any choice but to say, okay, let's shut this down, for safety's sake. And it's hard for the public to hear that. I think most people would understand, and then it just has to go to the ground at that point, and they have to do their best with, what they have and the numbers that they have to try and work with what they're given, unfortunately. That's just.
Mike, is it specific from a pilot standpoint? Is it a specific set of criteria that is met by a wind speed or by where the fire is, or is it just what you're feeling at that moment and what your pilots and you are experiencing, where you just say, okay, I can handle this, but 10 minutes later you go, okay, that's it. Are there numbers to go with that, or is it feel?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. It sort of depends, but in the end, it's exactly what you said. We here at our operation, we don't necessarily set a wind speed limitation. The only speed limitation is in the rotorcraft flight manual that has to do with starting and stopping the aircraft,
Right.
Getting it running. And a lot of times here at the base, we're a little bit sheltered, so we can safely start the aircraft or shut down the aircraft. And then we go out and we give it a try. And 99.9% of the time, we're going to work. Now, the Fed and the state requirements do have a limitation on them. I think there's a little bit of interpretation to that because you can't exactly judge exactly what the wind speeds are when you're in the aircraft. You can only go on, weather data and reporting. But they do have a limitation on that for safety. And until we become a part of that incident and we fall under their rules and requirements, we go with what you just said, which is we make our own assessment on whether we can do it safely and be effective, with what we're doing. And like I said, in 17 years, the first time I've been shut down, or should I say we have been shut down. And, I have to believe that in my heart that it was the right decision.
Oh, it was.
Because
I'm sure it was.
Imagine what the outcome, at that point could be if you lose an aircraft or two. So, yeah, that's it. It's a tough one. So far, to my knowledge, after that first night, the air operation pretty much continued with some pretty bad conditions. Today, I think the incident itself is probably on the verge of what they consider the wind limit requirements. I know they moved some aircraft around to get them out of those areas where those wind speed limits would affect their ability to start and stop. They shuffled them around, and hopefully that will be, functional so that we can continue. The Palisades incident is in pretty good check right now, but the concern with the high winds. So the higher winds for the next couple of days are predicted to be a little more to the west. So Ventura County over towards Palisades, and that block is supposed to be some of the higher winds. So there's some concern about the western end of the fire possibly flaring up or jumping the dozer lines or the hand lines that they already have in there. The fire actually burned up to the edge of the Franklin, which was, 3 weeks ago or whatever it was for that wind event. But the concern would be on the north side, right around or just west of Saddle Peak, up along Payuma, and then down. So the north slope from there, from Payuma down to Mulholland, which is in the Las Virgenes Malibu Canyon area, but on the north side.
Yeah.
There's a lot of heavy fuel in there. There's a lot of houses and things like that. So that's kind of what we're watching hard to see. And then we're also looking hard at the western side of Eaton, the Eaton incident, which is right there in the Arroyo Seco drainage near JPL, that facility there below Mount Wilson, a little bit southwest of Mount Wilson. That's an area of concern as well. It's in good check right now, but with the winds, the way they're predicted, supposed to peak tomorrow morning, I guess about 4 a.m., unless it changes. But there's a very real possibility that, these winds can affect some of the work that's already been done, some of the containment.
Yeah.
So that's what we're watching the most right now.
And that's just the incidents that are currently burning. There's going to be new starts that pop up overnight and tomorrow morning. So you guys, man, you guys are doing the Lord's work out there. It's really impressive to see the operations taking place despite the wind conditions. And for folks that aren't familiar with these kind of conditions, like Mike mentioned, it's not just the speed of the wind that's the problem. It's the gusting and it's the downdrafts that you referred to. 1,500 foot per minute downdraft rate of descent. That's scary. When you're operating at 500 feet AGL, it doesn't give you any room at all. You're in the ground minus 1,000 feet. Can you talk about that a little bit and what that experience is like and how scary it is as a pilot?
So the Type 2s, the 412, which was what I was in that particular night, you look at a situation where you're out of power. You're applying 100% of the power available and you're not arresting your sink rate. And you're at a good, you're at a good speed. You're at a max rate of climb airspeed, which theoretically should be the most efficient. But, when you're in that condition, you're really along for the ride and you're just hoping that maybe you change the direction of the aircraft a little bit. If you're already into the wind, it's a real problem. If you're not into the wind, you can obviously you can turn into the wind. That gets a little scary. The Hawks obviously perform better. It's just a more powerful, robust machine, so they handle it a little bit better. But they still essentially, are affected in the same way. So no, it's not a comfortable feeling by any stretch. At one point, I was flying into the wind, and I was indicating 11 knots on the ground speed, and I had 85 indicated on my airspeed indicator.
Wow. Jeez, that's crazy.
And I actually was going backwards at one point.
Yeah.
So I looked down, and it was at night, obviously, and I looked down and I'm like, holy shit, man, I'm actually creeping backwards, and so like, well, at least I'm not getting bounced around at this point because I was a little higher, right? So I was probably over that wave as it ran down the north, or the south slope there, and going down to the surface, and I kind of got above it a little bit, if you will. So it was a little more laminar up there in terms of turbulence, but the speed was ridiculous.
That's crazy.
That's kind of why. And on the way over to the Eaton is when there was some serious shear zones going through there. I had one instance where, I bounced down, I bounced up, and I went into negative G. And by the time it let go of me, my transmission pressure light had come on.
Oh.
on the panel. So I'm like, well, and it didn't happen again en route. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm just going to kind of continue to probe this. Now I know where the shear zone is between the two, spaces. The aircraft behind me hit the same thing. And then the aircraft behind him hit the same thing. Only one was a Hawk and the other was a 412. So that's when we started discussing, whether or not we're going to continue to try and attack it. And the flame lengths and the speed of the movement was so dramatic that, I knew, and you couldn't get under it, right? At that point, when it first starts, the fire is fairly narrow. So it's got a relatively short fire front. And the only way you could get any water on it, you could try and throw it from the side, but the smoke is laying over right in front of the fire front, right? So there's no real way you can sort of start to pinch it from the sides. And it was still pretty close to the slope itself. So you couldn't fly into the wind effectively without having the terrain essentially right in front of you. So you have like 3 or 4 different problems that you even have to attempt to solve with the conditions, that we had. And within maybe 10 minutes to 15 minutes, it was already across the river and into the first road and line of, houses. And that's where it got, at that point, it was like, there's no way we're going to be able to stop this.
Yeah.
And come to the realization that's the end of the, now it's going to get really, really bad.
Yeah.
So that was not a very fun night.
When I worked for the U.S. Forest Service in 2003, we had the old fire, and it was in line with the Grand Prix fire. I don't know if you worked those, Mike, but I was on a U.S. Forest Service Type 3 engine fighting that. And I remember one aircraft was grounded. There was too turbulent. They couldn't get into the location where the fire was. And from a ground perspective, we're essentially steering the fire. We couldn't suppress it. It was burning too fast, spotting too far out in front of itself. Can you talk about the conditions that existed on the ground as it pertains to that? How far did you see spotting? What was the terrain like? And you kind of mentioned how quickly it had entered into that urban interface environment where you have homes in there. Can you describe that a little bit so people get some understanding as to what that looked like?
It got into the urban area there so quickly. All you could really see is the trees that line streets, the palm trees, the other greenery, if you will. That area is kind of known for in terms of its beauty. When it hits the tops of those, they become like, giant candles, and then they start spitting out material, especially palm trees. Here's your first thing: get rid of your palm trees, right? And they become these Roman candles, and they just start spitting stuff all over the place. And those embers, a lot of times, are what help it jump from house to house or get a house started. And once one house gets started, then it just starts a domino effect on those houses. So if you've got a quarter-mile wide fire front going into an urban area with that kind of movement, you're going to have that quarter-mile wide first group of homes and trees and everything else catch on fire, and then it's going to get wider from there. And at that point, the guys on the ground are just literally going. At that point, I think what I was hearing on the radio was essentially it was all about evacuation. You weren't going to fight any fire, right? It's save lives first. It's always lives and then property. And so, everybody, law enforcement, everybody's trying to get in there and help people get out of the house and get on the road and get out. And there's linear blocks there, so there's several streets, but a lot of those streets, they kind of drive into main boulevards. So obviously those are going to be choke points where, numerous cars are trying to get out. You probably saw some of the footage at Palisades where the cars were stuck and they had to get out and leave them, right? Because one way in, one way out over there. A little better over in Altadena, but still the same problem. You could already see cars starting to choke, in that area as they're trying to, evacuate. And so, at that point, it's really just about trying to save as many people as possible. Yeah. That's how extreme, that moment becomes. It's like, forget about firefighting. Let's get people out.
Yeah. I've never seen a LA County dozer ever in my life push rows of cars off the street. I saw that. I was like, holy cow.
Yeah. That was amazing.
Yeah. That's another one. If you abandon your car and the fire is there, leave your keys in the car, and allow emergency personnel to, possibly at least move it up onto the curb, move it onto the sidewalk, whatever, needs to be to clear a space so that emergency vehicles can get in and other people can get out.
Yeah.
That's a big learning piece here that we saw that, it doesn't happen very often, but Paradise had something similar. Both evacuation routes were blocked.
Yeah.
People had to abandon cars, things of that nature.
I remember getting dispatched to fires, and you'd pull out of the station, you'd see a header. You're like, holy cow, it's time to get to work. Talk to us about your initial dispatch, seeing the initial destruction taking place and what your initial thoughts were on the fire itself.
You protect and defend. So do we. Astronautics' proven cybersecurity, connectivity, and upgrade solutions support helicopter OEMs and operators worldwide. When the mission matters, you need to trust that your avionics systems are secure, connected, and reliable because lives depend on it. Continue to protect and defend. So will we. Contact Astronautics at www.astronautics.com.
Well, so on the Eaton, that one started a little bit after the Palisades. So I was dispatched as Helco, and our other aircraft were dispatched to the fire with LA City. That's in LA City's jurisdiction. So they had their aircraft launched, and they had their Helco as the primary over there. So we were doubling up. We still got in the air. And actually, I take that back. We shut down, and then shortly thereafter, we got responded to Eaton, and so that's when I launched for the Eaton. So I couldn't really see it, but as soon as I turned the corner on it, I knew we were in big trouble. it was already a very large fire. So now we had two, within the county, two very, very large fires within, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. A lot of times when you see a header, you can kind of gauge a little bit about what it's doing, how vertical is the smoke, how much smoke, kind of see where it's at. We know the area pretty well. So when you see a header, you kind of know about where it is, what the terrain is around there, what the fuels probably are around there. So you can gauge it a little bit. But, with these conditions, you just know immediately it's going to be, a very serious problem, no matter what, on any of them. We also had several other fires over the course of the next 48 hours. We had the Hearst fire, we had the Freddie fire, we had the Lydia fire, of which we had the Kenneth fire. That was a couple days later. That one was close to being a big problem as well. I was in a hawk on that one. So I've only been Helco on the one that first night, and then I've been flying the hawks the rest of the time.
Right before we pressed record, Mike, you kind of went down some stats from the last 7 days that were just astounding from the LA County Fire Air Ops point of view. Could you give us those again for our listeners? We've
been manning 6 aircraft 24 hours a day. We set up essentially a rotating schedule. So we had an A shift, B shift through the night to cover the entire night period, which we've done up until 2 nights ago. We would time out and then we would swap crews. So we were shuffling our crews around. And then once you finished flying, you went and manned an air squad for the night or for the rest of whatever your period may or may not be. And we're trying to push crews forward, trying to sort of kind of keep them on the same circadian cycle, but not really. Least fatigued, least amount of flying, which, by a couple of days, everybody's about at the same point anyway, so it really doesn't matter. But we're trying to manage that as best that we can. We flew for the week 157 hours on our aircraft. It averaged out, I think each pilot is around 35 to 40 hours of flying in that between 4 and 6 day period of time. And we dropped about 1,100 times.
1,100 water drops.
Yeah.
Wow.
So a lot of water delivery.
Yes.
I think when they put together the stats of all the helicopters, all the water drops, all the tanker drops, everything collectively, I mean, it's going to be a mind-boggling number.
Yeah. No doubt.
Sure. Mike, you've been doing this for a long time. When you think back over all the incidents and fires you've been a part of, what sets this particular fire apart from the other ones?
The size, I would call it moderate in total size by acreage per se. Well, first of all, I'd say the destruction. Bar none. I mean, we kind of rank ourselves on whether we lose houses or not. And most of the time we don't lose houses. If we lose one, we got a problem. If we lose 2 or 3 or 5, we're crying.
Yeah.
So we kind of, that's kind of that initial gauge, if you will. But this one, because of its location and because of its size and because of the terrain and because of the number of houses that were impacted or threatened or soon to be threatened, it becomes very complicated to try and orchestrate tactics and strategy. And then you have a variety of different types of aircraft as well as agencies and or contractors and such. And very, very difficult task for Helco to sort of do what you would say is traditional, where you analyze what the fire is doing, what the effect of the terrain is going to be, and what priorities are going to be, and then adjust those resources accordingly. At the same time, they're trying to put in containment lines with tankers, right? So you're kind of doing a multi-strategy attack, if you will. That was a really, and I got to say, from a bigger perspective, pretty damn well done overall. Like anything, as dynamic as a fire is, sometimes things are going real well, and then sometimes they don't go so well, and then sometimes there's an emerging threat that has to be addressed. That was very difficult to do because resources were tied up. There were so many emerging threats, immediates, that trying to stay in front of those before they become problematic is difficult. A lot of times while you're working, you're able to sort of keep an eye on what you think might be an emerging threat. And it's not really enough to go after yet, if you will, by priority. Because things were so vast in that regard and there were so many concerns, a lot of times we were being maybe a little reactive rather than proactive. And so then you would adjust and you would handle that emerging threat, and then you'd go back to what you were doing, and you might have lost some of the headway that you were, working on to start with. And that becomes a little frustrating. So for the size, scope, number of aircraft, and complexity, I guess I would put it in that category: size, scope, complexity, and the number of continuing threats that have to be addressed simultaneously. By far I would say the hardest, not the worst, but the hardest, and trying to do that. And, but having looked at it or looked back on it, not that it's over, mind you, I think it went pretty well, especially when you consider all the different agencies working together, all the different contractors working together, all the different entities that don't work together. A small example would be there were 6 of us working out of Encino over on the Alpha side. And when we first got out there, it was a little chaotic, not really a place to anchor, not really a place to start any sort of combined tactics initially. Some of it was the condition. Some of it was in fuel that you can't attack because it's just it's too much fire. And then in 30 minutes or so, after everybody taking some laps, starting to analyze what's going on, conditions are changing a little bit, fire lays down a little bit, we get into this coordinated sequence, if you will, and we start knocking away some actual strategy, right? Like holding it at a ridge and anchoring off of a dozer line. And the good news about that was, we got a really good stretch of line on a ridge on the northwest corner of Mendonville Canyon, which was a threat on Friday into Saturday. And when I went back over there Saturday morning, because I got called out at 6:30 that morning to go back, that ridge was still held. I mean, was in good shape. Now, unfortunately, it moved a little further south, down towards more houses. And of course, that's probably what you saw on Saturday, where they were laying a lot of retardant and the helicopters were working in there. Unfortunately, there's a really big set of power lines that ran right along that ridge just below into the middle. So once it worked its way closer to the houses, it was very difficult to get low enough in there to do any real work. So Saturday morning when I went over there, I shifted from Encino over to Stone Canyon, which was a much quicker turn. And there was a spur ridge on the south side of Mendonville where the houses started that run down like into Santa Monica and down in that area. And we got enough resources over there and made a really good hold or save, if you will, on those structures. And then from there, we started building line back up to the original ridge I was talking about along that line. Unfortunately, the center portion of that near those wires is where it couldn't really be checked, if you will. And I think there was at least one house that might have taken it on that. But that's sort of when the conditions are right and the wind is reasonable and you can get aircraft orchestrated like that and lined up and working together, that's when you're going to see the best effect of what you're doing. Yeah. And the other part that I'd like to mention if people are listening is that sometimes what the aircraft are doing or what they're not doing doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like, why aren't you going there, or why aren't you dropping on that, or why aren't you doing? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it might not be safe to drop in there, like for example the wires or something. The wind conditions don't allow you to safely get low enough to do anything, anyways. And two, there usually is a strategy to what you're trying to do tactically, right? You're trying to make tactical use of the aircraft rather than just dropping. You can drop over here and you can drop over there and you can put fire out, but you're not really doing anything except putting that little piece of fire out. When in reality, if you're working a certain area and you're doing what I was talking about, which is daisy chain working, building line, you're going to be much more effective in the bigger picture. People don't understand that when you have multiple priorities, that you might be working those priorities, even though there might be other priorities, but maybe not quite as valuable. And that sounds horrible. People don't want to hear that because many times they end up losing their house because there's no attention to it. And the other part of it is you have to have support from the ground. The air component can't, in some instances they can, but they can't necessarily just put out the fire by themselves. You can knock it down. You can take a lot of flame out. You can make it safe for the guys to get in there and cut line, get a dozer in there or whatever the case may be. But without the support, many times your work is not necessarily the most useful. That's a kind of a politically correct way of putting it. And I'm sure that the public doesn't fully understand that. I think they could appreciate it if it was explained to them, but it doesn't do any good when your house is gone. It's emotional. And, a lot of my flashbacks started coming from the Woolsey fire, trying to explain at a city council meeting, what's going on from the air side when they're asking these questions, and trying to say it in a way that is sensitive to, their emotional state, but realizing that, we have to do that. Yes, we do have to pick priorities. Sometimes it's not yours because there's so many priorities and you can only handle so many, but it's an effort to try and exercise good tactical strategy. When you watch the tankers, for example, a lot of times you don't necessarily see them go direct. You see them building containment lines out on a ridge off the fire. And they might go, well, why are you dropping retardant so far away from the fire? Well, the fire behavior specialists, they know that we're not going to be able to contain certain areas, or we're not going to be able to fight fire in those areas. And those containment lines or those outer lines are being used as a point where they're going to build dozer lines and they're going to make a stand at that containment line. And there's generally not structures or anything in between them. Like they're saying, oh, well, forget about these structures. We're going to contain it here. They're built in a way that it's open space. It is just bushes, right? So you let that burn to a place where you can effectively attack that fire, which is usually on ridges, right? Most of the growth, the heavy growth, is in those lower drainages where there's a little more water and runoff, and the fuel grows there very readily, and it's going to fire so hard that your drops they're useless.
Right.
They're useless. So those little nuances are some of the things that it would be nice, to help them understand a little bit about what's going on there, realistically. And then sometimes you have to abandon what you're doing, and it's full on structure defense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a priority. It's getting ready to hit houses, and everything gets redirected, to it. We had that example. I think it was on Friday. We were listening to the radio. We were working in another division over on the west side. There were three of us, our three Hawks. We heard this on the radio for about 10 minutes, but there were no resources that weren't already committed to, other priorities. So I made an assessment that what we were working on was well in check. And I just called Helco and said, we're coming over there. And so The three of us in tow went over. Fortunately, 69 Bravo, which has 4 tanks. Unfortunately, at that time, the water was not functioning well, but the tanks were full. We pretty much used up all the water in the tanks, but we had 3 Hawks over there. We got another CAL FIRE Hawk over, and we made what I would consider unequivocally a huge, legitimate save, because we were doing that exact thing, right? We lined up, we tag teamed, we extended off of each drop, we hit it, put a lot of pressure on it, a lot of pressure, a lot of water, really, really quick turnaround because it was only about a quarter mile away. And then they brought in tankers and went direct on where we were dropping, right over the top of us, and were thankfully able to put that whole thing down, because had it crossed, it had a little road barrier, had it crossed that road and got established on those houses, it would have made a run up that north slope hard. And there's a lot of houses in there, a lot of houses.
Where was that at, Mike?
It was in Topanga in what they call Division Victor. I couldn't give you a street name.
Yeah.
And,
But Topanga area.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. West side of Topanga Canyon on the north slope, kind of more towards the south corner of the fire there.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, it's still,
That's
still
a big save. You mentioned a few minutes ago a big save at Mandeville on Saturday, and from that daisy chain effect. Just for those listeners, just to understand the terrain that Mike's talking about, Mandeville Canyon is a long canyon that goes northbound from Sunset Boulevard, west of the 405, west of the Getty Museum, and it is mostly a lot of older houses. They're very tight together. There's a lot of old growth there. Just trees. You can go up streets that you can't even imagine. It almost covers the street. There is a lot of trees and brush, and a lot of brush that hasn't burned. And on Saturday when I was watching, I kept going, wow, I'm not a fire guy, and I could see the progress that you were talking about, Mike. It was evident. And you called it a big save. It was a huge save. Those efforts by all of you, that's a huge save. If Mandeville gets started, it's going to be kind of like Altadena and the Palisades, where once the domino effect. Do you agree with that assessment? The domino effect, that particular canyon is just, it's almost a disaster waiting to happen. And that big save kept it from happening. Well done.
We knew that area was going to be threatened in time. And fortunately, believe it or not, the wind direction being out of the north for that particular area is a good thing.
Wow.
Because it was a backing fire. It was backing fire downhill. So the rate of spread is considerably less than if you had prevailing winds coming off the ocean and pushing it towards the bottom of the canyon.
Gotcha.
Right. So it did, in that particular instance, it gave us a little bit of assistance.
Yeah. Because Mandeville, if that goes, that leads to Brentwood. That whole area is very vulnerable. And so that was a huge save that occurred, that what you described on Saturday. Very well coordinated. And like I said, somebody who knows nothing or very little about this was watching and going, they are making a difference here. You could see it. You could really see that drop after drop after drop. It was just that daisy chain you were talking about. And next thing you know, it was significantly less of a concern. That's incredible. But it was great to see.
You gotta take the good victories with
you do.
Yeah,
you do. Because there are victories. There absolutely are victories.
You brought up the emotional side of what you're doing a little bit ago. And I go back to my time in 2003 on the old fire. We lost a big section of homes that we were directly responsible for protecting. And it was emotionally challenging for us, knowing that we were responsible for that area and we had lost it. It wasn't our fault, but it still was challenging. Can you talk about, from your perspective, your ability to kind of push the emotional side of that, seeing all this devastation take place and allowing yourself to channel and focus on the positive work you're doing?
Well, I suppose that the easiest way to describe that is that, especially at night, the level of concentration required just to do the basic work, to keep from running into stuff, and you're constantly searching with the night sun for hazards. There's ham radio towers that stick up that aren't lit over the houses. There's supply line wires. There's large 250 kV. There's a lot of stuff. You tend to get really, really focused on managing your power, taking as much water as you can possibly take, keeping the aircraft from going into the water.
Yeah.
Doing all those things. You've got several switches on your cycling collective. You're running the snorkel up and down and all these things. So point being, you're intently focused on it, and you tend to get away from a little bit of that emotional. You're at a very fast, high intensity pace. You're trying to be as quick and efficient as you can, getting in and out of water to get as much water over to the fire. So you tend to sort of push some of those other, aspects out of your mind until after the fact. You do change a little bit when you know that there's an immediate threat with a house, and you're going to be dropping right up, next to a house, and your stress level rises because you want to make sure that, you might only get 1 or 2 chances at it. And if you're off, or you don't adjust for the wind right, or you're a little bit late with your release, and you don't get max effectiveness out of your water, that's probably the one immediate thing that bothers me the most. All I want to hear from the crew member is he basically says 3 things. He says, "That's a miss," which I fortunately don't hear too often. The next one is effective. And the third one is money. So I want to hear money, pretty much every time. I'll settle for effective, but I'm going for money. Then once you get done with the night or the day or whatever it is you've been doing, that's when you kind of get a little retrospective on it and kind of go, did I perform to the best of my ability? Was I accurate with what I was doing? Was I efficient with what I was doing? And did I not risk anybody's well-being by doing something stupid or being too aggressive? I like to think that we, as a unit, are very aggressive with our firing, especially on these types of fires, as well as our initial attack. We move very quickly. I think we do it very efficiently, and we work like a gun team almost, and we pair up, or we triple up, or we do whatever because we know how effective that works. I think that's, and I would say we have a few more resources than some of the other agencies around here. They might have 2 or whatever. We're used to working in larger numbers. So we have a pretty refined process of strategy and tactics. Contractors don't necessarily work that way. They work a little bit more independently based on their machine and the fires that they work and things like that. Ours is initial attack. It's all critical. It's right there in the infrastructure, and we gotta look, identify, assess, and drop. And it's got to be done almost on your first in run. That's when we're most effective. Is we don't want to circle a bunch and try and figure things out. We want to identify where the most effective drop is going to be and where we're going to start our actual tactic or strategy on it. We've got Helco. Our pilots fly Helco, obviously, as well as our chief officer. And so they think in the same manner, and they get to see it between drops. So they're constantly watching what we're doing and whether or not we're effective or whether or not we need to shift our focus. And that teamwork of being together and doing this so much, I think really makes a big difference and absolutely adds to how successful we are.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily talking about the Palisades per se, but I mean as a general rule when we do these IAs.
Thank you to our sponsor, Robinson Helicopter Company, the choice for unrivaled safety and reliability, so you can accomplish any mission with confidence. For more than half a century, Robinson has been at the forefront of the helicopter industry. From the R-22 to the R-66 turbine, Robinson makes helicopters accessible so more people can accomplish more missions. climb higher. For additional information, visit www.robinsonheli.com.
A smaller example on the Ken Fire, we didn't necessarily still alarm it, but our aircraft were out on the Palisades. We saw the fire start. We heard the dispatch go out. And unfortunately, I was sitting at about 550 pounds of fuel. So I was not happy, but I knew that the water source there was a water source nearby, but I knew it wasn't on. It was a tank. Since I was the first one in, I just went straight into the tank, landed, had our crew member get out and turn the tank on because I knew follow-on aircraft were going to be coming in, and I knew that I had to go get fuel. So I was, kind of stressing about the fact that we're short one Type 1 on a really fast-moving grass fire. That's that kind of, what's most important here to supply the aircraft that are going to be right behind me so that we can actually start dropping water. Fortunately, there were some loaded tankers, and the air attack shifted over from the Palisades and got those guys in right away and put a line on the right flank and allowed us, the helicopters, to really attack the left flank. And as soon as they laid down a line pretty much around it, we were able to shift over and work, both flanks simultaneously, and we were able to catch it. It was right running up on some houses in the Las Virgenes, on the north end of Las Virgenes. That was a pretty damn good save, considering it. And it was all in the Woolsey burn, so it was all grass, not a lot of heavy fuel, but it moved like lightning through that grass. Fortunately, water drops are pretty effective in grass, obviously, right? You carry a fair amount of water, and if you get a good drop, you can take care of 7,500 yards of grass flank with maybe one drop. And if we daisy chain that, we can really take some long lines on that. And obviously, because it was a second start, there weren't any resources right there, ground resources. So that took a little time to get them redirected and established on it. So the fact that we had anybody available, enough people and or engines to get over and on that in the time that we did, was pretty spectacular as far as I'm concerned.
Bringing up the fuel types, can you talk about, I know there's a variety because you've got multiple fires in different areas of the basin, but can you talk about the predominant fuel types you're seeing in the two fires you're working with now?
Well, primarily the Palisades, because the Eaton, I guess I shouldn't say that. So let's start with the Eaton. It ran downhill and into the urban area, into the town of Altadena. It wasn't really super wide from where it started to where it hit the homes, but then it started to spread out like it normally would, right? And it would become terrain driven. And it was pretty good for a while until it backed high enough into some heavier fuel that's right below Mount Wilson. And at that point, when it hit it, it was off to the races. It was going to run to the top for sure. And that's exactly what it did. Some of that area there is burned relatively recently, so the fuel is not super heavy, but it's like a lot of scrub oak and just brush, mainly again in the lower drainage areas. So those make pretty significant runs in there. The concern is the Arroyo Seco, which is a very large waterway, if you will, a very large drainage, a main drainage out of the Angeles. And there's a lot of heavy stuff in there, a lot of really old oak and trees, timber, a little bit of timber, and a lot of brush. So they were able to hold it pretty well on, I think it's the alpha side, if I'm not mistaken. And so we have that variety, right? The good news is we have natural breaks in a lot of our terrain, steep slopes with no fuel on it whatsoever, or rocky outcroppings, things like that. Those are great places to anchor off of. You don't have to worry about that piece because the fire will burn out on its own a lot of times. The Palisades, however, started in an area that had, I think I heard it's been 50 or 60 years since that's burned.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the brush in there was like max. super dry, really low moisture, fuel moisture levels, certainly because of lack of rain as well. And, just voracious fire activity in that entire area. There's a lot of trails up there, mountain bike trails, hiking trails, open space. And, once it got established in there, again, the thing I mentioned it. So wind driven and terrain driven fire are a little bit different, but just because you have wind driven fire does not mean that you're not going to have terrain driven portions of the fire at some point in time. Alignment would be where the terrain and the wind are in perfect order, perfect alignment, and that's the worst case scenario. So that's another tactic, is trying to stop a particular area from getting into alignment, as we call it. So aircraft might be, again, tactics and strategy, trying to work a piece of terrain to keep it from coming into alignment. So you might see, well, what are they doing over there? Somebody who's watching might say, why are they focusing over there? It's because we want to keep it out of alignment, because then it's going to make a really heavy run, things like that. So unfortunately, Topanga, that area between the 405 and Topanga Canyon, north of Palisades, south of Woodland Hills, Encino area, that box in there, it's just, it did have a ton of fuel in there. Most of it's, gone, burnt out. But that's what was a big part of the problem. And keeping it narrow too. The basic strategy is anchor and flank and keep the fire as narrow as possible until you can come around and sort of pinch it. Ideally, that's what you try and do. But when it's a large fire, that becomes very difficult. It makes those terrain runs. It makes the alignment runs. And the next thing you know, it's very wide, and those flanks become longer and longer and longer, and therefore harder to, put down. After it made its run through Palisades, unfortunately, the next piece of that would be try and keep it from getting as wide as possible. And as it widens out, it's headed towards Topanga Canyon and all the houses that are in and around Topanga Canyon. So then that becomes one of the strategies. And then, of course, as it widened, it went over into Minmaville Canyon, right? So that's that widening piece, that I was talking about. And even though the wind was blowing out of the north, it still was backing up to that east-west ridge that splits Encino and Woodland Hills, and then down to Palisades and, Brentwood and Santa Monica and all of that. There is a predominant ridge. You probably saw on the news, it was Saturday or Sunday, they were really hitting that ridge hard with retardant, because that was going to be that stand there. They were reinforcing. They put they put a line, but then they doubled up on that line of retardant, and a huge dozer line up there as well, to make sure that it didn't, especially if the winds, typically when the north winds stop, the prevailing winds start, and that would be a reversal of everything. So now you would have winds coming off the ocean, pushing it north towards Encino and Woodland Hills, which is what you don't want. So that's why they hit that ridge so hard to contain it there. That's just the way, Southern California is. It's oaks, it's heavy brush, some timber, in the forests, but, and it grows pretty readily, even if it doesn't burn for 10 years, you around here typically, the Woolsey print is a little bit different, but generally within, 3 to 5 years, it's kind of hard to even see a burn scar.
Yeah.
It's pretty miraculous how quickly, Mother Nature takes over and starts kind of rejuvenating itself, which then lends itself to the argument about forest management and the role that it plays in fire behavior. I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but, we all understand that. Controlled burns and why they're important, and quite frankly, those controlled burns have gone way, 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 way down over the last many, many, many years for a variety of reasons. And we in the fire side, all understand that that's a pretty important component. to management and trying to keep fires from the fire behavior from being overly extreme, and it's hard though, right? Everybody wants to live in the wilderness or in the environment or have beautiful, trees and views and canyons and all this stuff. And that's fine. But, you have to understand that there's a threat to it. Clear space around homes, very, very big deal. It does not mean that, that's 100% for you, but it's important that, especially if you're living in those vulnerable areas, to take care of that. It doesn't look as nice, obviously, but it's there for a reason, and it's a very important reason. So, that's, Southern California is its own little animal with that stuff. And,
I looked that up on Saturday when I was watching the Mandeville Canyon stuff. I looked up what's the LA city ordinance for distance for defensible area where you have to keep the brush cut back. And it said 200 feet.
Yeah.
And I was watching live footage of houses that had 0 feet of clearing. 0. There was brush up against wooden plank fences in Mandeville. And I was thinking, what happened? Is 200 pretty typical in fire service, or as far as ordinance? I know it isn't reality, but
I don't know about the ordinance and, from other agencies or other localities, things of that nature. But I'm sure it's going to, change in the future.
Yeah.
There might be a lot of homes that have some exemptions based on, historicals.
Sure.
I really don't know. But I can say this in all honesty that a lot of times, believe it or not, even when they have clear space, if you got a big tree right up against your house, as nice as it is to have it, unfortunately, in the right circumstances, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
When those things start breaking off or really catching on fire, a lot of times with the heat, it'll break windows and then stuff flies inside the house. It gets up under eaves. The house looks fine for 2 or 3 hours and then it catches on fire. So there are certain realities that I think even under best intentions and efforts to protect your home, it might not do it.
Right.
That's just a sad fact. But one thing for certain, if the fire starts and you don't have any of that, it's almost a guarantee that unless some miracle happens, that you're probably going to be affected by it, in a bad way.
Mike, can you talk about some of the mutual aid resources that have started to come into the area and what that's allowed you guys to refocus on or focus on as an aviation asset within the county?
So typically what will happen, if people don't know this, we've got LRA for local response area. We have areas where they're multi-jurisdictional, mutual threat zones, they call them. You've got state land responsibility, SRA, and you've got federal, FRA. But on incidents like this, it becomes kind of unified and it's kind of all hands on deck, if you will. So all the resources as needed will support, whether it's in the forest or whether it's all on state land, local land, et cetera. And in this particular instance, we've pretty much seen everybody. CAL FIRE has its hawks down here, which have been great, several of them. All the contractors at NCWNs have come with many aircraft of all types, a lot more hawks this time around, seeing them, which is pretty sweet.
Wait, you said CWNs. I'm assuming that's call when needed.
Yeah, call when needed aircraft. During the season, those contractors, they try and get exclusive use contracts for certain regions and areas, certainly within the state. And then there's a lot of call when needed. So they're sitting there available for response, not just to here, but nationally, depending on what their status is. So those start coming as well. Like I said before, sometimes it takes a little while for them to get here. They might be in Idaho, or they might be in Utah, Oregon, wherever. The military side of things with the MAF, you saw the C-130 MAF drop in. The Guard has come with some bucket aircraft to support. So it's been kind of like every agency is pushed in. OCFA or Orange County with their Hawks have been up. Ventura County has been here as well. Like I said, LA City, our aircraft. It's been a pretty robust. I think there was 27 aircraft available for the Palisades at one point.
Oh.
But then, of course, and the other part is you got to realize there's limitations to those, right? They can only fly so many hours in a given day. So I think, if I recall, 17 is the number that were available for night, which I think is unprecedented.
Yeah, that's a lot.
On an incident now, as the night firefighting becomes more prevalent with technology and more agencies, pretty much all agencies now are flying NVGs, to my knowledge. More private companies that are investing, and it is a big investment, so it's understandable why they have to have double the crews, double the staff, investments in lighting and other requirements for the aircraft, the night vision goggles themselves, and then you need a qualified and trained pilot and crew, to do it. And that obviously can be quite expensive.
Yeah.
And it's growing. It's that area is definitely growing. I would venture to say probably the majority of the pilots are, have a military background, for example. However, it's also a learning curve for some of the agencies. CAL FIRE is pretty new to the night NVG firefighting arena, so they're going to have a learning curve on how to work that piece of it. But so far, the night, I'm pretty big on the whole night thing in terms of what I would consider limitations to it for safety purposes, an appropriate number of aircraft in a given space, how well they're working and coordinating together in terms of knowing where everybody is in the orbit or where they are in any given time and space. The situational awareness sort of bubble has to be right for safety. Even with all your lights on, even with everything, you can be bleached out coming over the top of the ridge with a fire behind you. You may not see their lights. So call outs are very important, and having a group that works sort of efficiently, together without causing any issues for each other. And it's gone pretty well, I got to say, on the nights that I flew. Was pretty pleased with how it was going and how integrated it was.
You talk about the technology that allows the nighttime firefighting to take place. I'm assuming you're talking about NVGs primarily, but some of the other technologies that might assist you guys in doing that. Are you guys using forward-looking infrared type systems to identify towers or anything like that?
No, a FLIR is a very, very expensive investment and is certainly valuable in certain circumstances, but it's hard enough with the goggles and how much light comes off the fire and the effect on the goggles themselves. It's just as bad or worse on a FLIR. The one thing that I could see in the value of having a FLIR on the aircraft would be to train the left seat crew member to operate that thing. I don't want my head down looking at stuff, but it certainly would be nice to have them looking for wires or other hazards and then being able to point them out by direction and distance from the aircraft so you're at least aware of them. The practical use of it on a tactical firefighting aircraft, a little bit limited, I think. I guess the ROI on it at this point is probably not necessarily there. You've got a weight increase, you've got maintenance requirements, you've got the cost of installation, the cost of the system itself is pretty damn high.
Mm-hmm. So
the absolute answer to that is, could it be of value? Yes, I think it probably could at some level. But I don't see the only aircraft that have it right now that I know of is the fixed wing, like the air attack platforms that have an EOIR system actually on them.
Mm-hmm.
And the Colson 76 has one. That is an aerial supervision platform. They do have a system on it, but other than that, there's not any that I know of.
Mike, there's a topic that has made national, even international news a topic that every public safety air crew that's listening has dealt with and been worried about, and that's drones. I heard a number yesterday on the news about saying this is how many drone incidents, whatever that is, has happened in this fire. I take it with a grain of salt when I hear the news. I want to ask Mike, what's been your experience and what you're hearing and seeing firsthand with the interference of drones on these fires?
So I haven't personally seen one, but you probably saw the news. We did have a collision,
Right.
Quebec's, right? It did have a collision with a drone. They are a huge problem in terms of what they cause to the airspace. It'll shut down air operations in that area until it's dealt with. I think they put up counter drone systems, and they had I think 112 in the first couple of hours.
Oh my gosh.
I don't quote me on the exact number.
No, I know.
It was a large number in a very short
half that. It's crazy. You know.
They do use drones, like we know that they're using drones over Palisades, and that's briefed as a hazard. They're 350 feet below over that area to identify looters, right? So they're being used by law enforcement to protect the citizens and the property there. But we know about them and we know where they're at.
Yeah.
But, you're in a TFR that is established TFR. They are in direct violation of every regulation associated with the operation of a drone as a private operator, regardless if you stay within the confines of what you're expected to when you fly a drone. And I don't believe, to my knowledge, that on any of the nights or during the time that I was out there that they shut down air in any particular section because of drones.
Good.
Which is, that's a good thing. But the people need to know, and the citizens need to know, that if they see somebody flying a damn drone and they're not law enforcement or they're not fire or they're not official, they need to treat them like a hostile.
Oh yeah, that's a felony.
Because, and I hope they do, because that's just
it's right there with laser strikes. It really is. My wife and I just talked about it this morning when they flashed the picture of the wing of the Super Scooper, the Quebec, and I said, imagine that coming through a helicopter windscreen.
Yep.
This would have been a even bigger disaster than that hole in that wing. That hole in that wing is scary, but a windscreen, that's really scary. And they're everywhere. So I'm glad we talked about it, because it's something that has to stop. Stops operations of life-saving and property-saving operations.
Right.
For what? For a little TikTok video or a YouTube video? It's disgraceful.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's really, really sad thing.
Well, I know you're on duty and you're subject to call at any point. So the last thing I kind of want to talk about is just the incident as a whole. Once this is done and over with, this is going to be studied for a long, long, long time. And we'll look back and figure out what our wins were and what our losses were and what lessons did we learn from this incident as a whole. From your perspective, can you talk about some of the early things you guys have identified as wins? We've talked about a few of those already. But then could you also talk about something that you've identified as something we could do better next time? And unfortunately, next time is tonight and tomorrow with the wind that's predicted. Can you talk about that a little bit? Thank you to our sponsor, Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 160 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors.
The bigger overriding piece of this is that it's very difficult to say that we as a city or a county or an agency are going to be able to man-equipped, resource, train a force, large enough to handle something like this or should I say stop it, right? The ability to stop it. Even with early warning systems, which they have, they've got satellite systems for early warning, knowing that the winds are coming, knowing that these events are coming. We do pre-stage, we do augment staff, we do a lot of things to gear up for it and to be ready. Local agencies do. I guess you could make an argument to pre-stage call when needed aircraft, have the guard on standby activated for it if they intend to use them in some capacity. I think the airplanes and the tankers all seem to be pretty responsive, right? So they are in the area, call it the Southwest, if you will, or the Western region. A lot of times we have wind events that are predicted that don't come to fruition, quite to the extent that they say. And so it's easy to get lulled into, well, is this really going to be the worst one since, the 1800s or 1967 or whatever it is? But we do watch them and we try and treat them accordingly, right? So we as an agency here, we're prepared. We have a pretty robust air section. Some of the agencies are a little bit smaller, right? So they only have what they have. The question then would be, do you want to look at the expenditure and the process of expanding it and having more resources locally or not? How far do you want to go with pre-staging strike teams and other resources from around the country? Because they have responsibilities as well, right? So pulling the trigger on that is a little bit hard. It's a little tricky of how far do you go with your preparation for it. I got to, in all honesty, collectively on the Palisades incident from the air side, I thought it went pretty well. I don't think there were any real near misses with aircraft, considering how many there were. Luckily, the fire was kind of large enough and spread out enough to where several aircraft could work a division without sort of encroaching on the others. That worked out pretty well. Trying to defeat Mother Nature like a hurricane or anything else, is a pretty tall task. There are a lot of resources. The coordination of the resources and getting them to work quickly, you would think you can always improve that, but the reality of it is there's just a certain piece of that takes some measure of time. It just does. And I will say this, sort of the world of type 2s, I think is kind of coming. It's not that they don't have some value, before I make that statement, our 412s, under the right environmental circumstances or conditions, which is a fair amount of time here in our area of operations, can be an effective tool. It can still work and do well. It's easier to get close to the crews and put, a small amount of water right in front of them. When I say small, I'm talking 300 gallons. I mean, that's a decent drop. But on fires with wind and heavier fuels, the aircraft that are truly effective are the type 1s. It's a bigger aircraft. It's more expensive. It's a bigger investment, which is why I'm really happy that CAL FIRE has gone to the Hawks. Phenomenal machine. I mean, not just because I'm biased, haven't been flown it for 30 years or whatever, 38 years. But the performance of the aircraft to the mission, to include the water dropping mission, is really second to none. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that the 47s can't carry more water and do things that we can't because of that, right? They're a very valuable piece as well, and a tool from the collective mission. And the reason why I like the Hawks so much more is because, in my personal opinion, we can make more turns in a much shorter period of time, and we have a much smaller maneuvering space requirement in order to get to places where water delivery might be critical. That to me is the real key. So I'm always a fan of multi-types of airframes that have different capabilities. that provide a multitude of capabilities. That I'm not advocating going away from that, but the smaller aircraft in this particular instance, in these conditions, in these fuels, is really, I'd say, marginally effective. Doesn't mean they can't be used. Doesn't mean they don't have some value. But when we're talking about these types of events, it's the bigger stuff that needs to be there.
Makes sense.
And collectively as an industry, I think we're going to that. We are. The Hawks that are coming into the industry out of the military, they are being built. They are being built up. They are being set up for firefighting. The speed of the aircraft, i.e. the 47 and the Hawk, and I'm talking about a tanked Hawk, is really, in my opinion, critical over the span of time. So I had a 10.4 hour period, and of that 10.4, probably, I'm going to say probably a solid 9 hours of it was like operational water dropping. And I made 90 drops. So 10 an hour is moving, right? And obviously the water source has a lot to do with that. But the moral of the story is the speed of the aircraft. The 47 is fast. The Hawk is fast. We have retractable snorkels, right? That allows us to utilize the speed of the helicopter. So we can dash very quickly, well, as quick as possible to the fire with the load, but we can really dash off the fire back to water. And I'm talking 130 knot dashes. So a snorkeled aircraft, like say the traditional Type 2 Huey that's carrying a snorkel, very limited on speed, right? Even a Hawk with a tank that has a snorkel dangling has a limited speed. Ours is 155 knots. That's our VNE. You're not going to get, I'm going to guess, I don't know this, but some of the systems that have the snorkels are probably, I'm going to say if they have a 100 knot limitation, I'd be surprised. It's probably more like 80 or 90. So the evolution of the aircraft and the systems on the aircraft and the investment in that, I think that's an area that can be pushed forward. So Hawks that are out there in the private industry, I mean, why not have a program where, maybe there's grant money, there's state money, there's Fed money available to modify them with those systems so they can utilize the speed of them, right? Things like that. Look at what they've done with the tankers and just the amazing stuff that the airplanes are doing with retardant delivery, right? Bigger, faster tanks that are designed to just make fantastic coverage on them. Our tank has a very specific design. The coverage capability of it, to me, is second to none, right? Doesn't mean there's not other tanks out there that are good and that work. I think ours is premier in that regard, and the ability to select it and manage it with a computer. So as time goes on and we get these other aircraft, specifically the two I was talking about, as they proliferate, it's going to be of minimal value, in my opinion, if they're not modified correctly to take advantage of what they can do. They still can carry more water, and that's a great thing. But the speed and the number of deliveries is a key component in keeping that pressure up on the tactics that I talked about earlier. Fast, 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 go, go, go. Not so fast that it's dangerous, but fast enough to where you can truly make a difference in the amount of pressure you apply to a given, portion of the fire.
There's one thing we know, and unfortunately, when there's a tragedy and a major incident like this, is it magnifies what could have been a problem that was kind of festering for a long time. So as you kind of zero in on what you're describing, maybe some money needs to be dedicated to the R&D to improve some of these systems. I'm hoping that money becomes more readily available from the federal government or grants or other locations within, our governmental system to help with what you're describing, because that does make sense.
Yeah, well, but on the flip side too, in their defense, a lot of these aircraft, the privates, they're multi-working aircraft, right? So they they do external loads, they do construction work, they do other things that making those kind of modifications might not make a lot of financial sense to them, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't reconfigure through the season or through the year. Our tank is removable and it comes off relatively quick, and we can get to the hook and use the hook for external loads, right? We do we do horse rescues that way. We have to drop the tank. It takes a little bit of time, but we've got a nice little system. We roll it in under the tank, unbolt it, drop it down, disconnect the cannon plugs, drop it down. And now we've got a hook capable aircraft for external loads. So it is a big investment. The system that we have on the aircraft is expensive. There's no doubt about it. And again, ROI for these guys is got to be considered. And that's where your comment, John, about money's available might fill that gap for them, right? So they don't feel like, hey, my fire season is only X. I don't want to deconfigure the aircraft, spend all this money when I'm not going to, when it's going to cost me money, and it's going to take me 5 years or whatever to recoup my money when I'm doing all these other things throughout the year. The aircraft that I'm talking about specifically are pretty much dedicated to just firefighting, right? So it's that specialty little niche where their return is there and it's valuable. And that's a little bit of a component that I see that is a differential there.
Well, man, it's been an honor to talk to you. I can't believe that you've got the energy to sit here and talk to us. Considering
I was thinking that the whole time. You must be exhausted, Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah, nicotine and caffeine work goes along.
Jack, as we wrap up, any closing thoughts or last little things you'd like to ask Mike?
Just thank you, Mike. Your insight is so valuable and so respected, not just by us. You're a good friend of the Hangar Z, and we value your perspective, your opinions, and really admire your work. I mean, I've watched you in action from my own front yard, saving my own neighborhood in Saugus years ago, and I know what you guys do. And I was grateful then, and I'm grateful now. And keep looking at the wins and the victories, even though they might seem small at the time. You are saving homes and saving lives, and we're thankful that you took the time to join us. Thanks, Mike.
Well, it's my pleasure. Very fortunate to work here and work in an organization that really puts a lot of emphasis on trying to stay in front of, good firework and protecting a very large area with a lot of citizens that pay a lot of money to have our resources available to help protect them. We've got a maintenance staff that, has just been killing it the last week. We did, so far we've done 2 40 hours and a 40 and a 120 on the aircraft in between, right? So as soon as that aircraft lands, it's on the tug and it's coming in and they're swarming it, getting it back going into the fight.
Yep. Truly the unsung heroes, really. Yeah. The maintenance guys that you can't leave until they get their jobs done, and they're amazing.
Yeah. And everybody here collectively, and I know this probably goes with every department because that's just the type of people that are there. But, when it's game on, everybody is, 100% in, and they're sleeping on a cot or they're doing whatever. And they'll work longer than we want to allow them to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they want to be in there doing what we're expected to do. And, I can't think of a better way to have spent the second career, my career in this particular arena, and especially here, trying to use my skill set to, do these kinds of things that make a difference in their lives. So it's a privilege, is what I'm getting at. And I work for the taxpayer and I'm here to earn my money, so.
You earned it this week. Oh my gosh.
Well, I said it before and I'll say it again, Mike, you've spent your career and your life protecting the citizens of our country, domestically and abroad. And we're forever thankful to you for all the efforts you've put into those areas. The last question that I'll throw your way before we end has to do with how folks can support the fire department. I know countless people want to donate and show some goodwill and a way of saying thank you to the work that y'all are doing. So how can the general public support fire crews and what you guys are doing during these incidents?
Well, I think they've done a pretty dang good job. You know, we've had several restaurants and other local vendors come by, bring us bagels, Thai food. You know, I mean, I'm eating better here, you know, in the last couple of days. And, you know, then I'm not a big eater, but man, they brought by some great stuff. I know on the Eaton, the Santa Anita racetrack is a center point for donations. I would like to think that as time goes on, people who just want to come in and work and help clean up and support, you know, once it's been cleared out and it's safe and can get in there and actually go back into the neighborhoods and start taking care of stuff, that they will orchestrate that and know that you're not there nefariously. You're there to help, you know, people. I don't know of anything specific that's taking place yet. I suspect it will. The fire departments, all agencies, they have to continue to upgrade equipment, whether it's aircraft or it's engines or it's support equipment, fire stations, you know, whatever. It is expensive. It's tax dollars. We were very fortunate to pass the last measure that had a small tax increase for funding to the fire department, which was needed badly. Unfortunately for aviation, it's incredibly expensive. You know, aircraft they're just horribly expensive. Quite frankly, we're a little behind on our life cycle replacement financially. It's a reality on our fleet as a whole. I know there's a lot of other engines and other equipment within the department that need it as well, and it's coming, you know, as time goes on. So be sensitive to the fact that the tax dollars that nobody likes to necessarily pay, at least for LA County. I'm talking for LA County, as big as we are, is important. It's very, very important to support the resources that are needed to do not just the firefighting mission and the aircraft, et cetera, but the EMS side of things is very, very large and robust and demanding in our county. Requires a lot of expenditure on the department's side to do it. The public is very, very good at moral and certainly financial support to fire departments. You know, they just are. It's a great place to be. You know, the fire department, everybody loves the fire department. You know, and I do not even begin to imply that we as in the firefighting community don't feel that love and support from the community, whether it's an emergency like this or not. It definitely shines during these times, you know, when things are really bad. We do this job because we want to do it and love it, and we're going to work until there's no more work to be done, basically. So we're very appreciative of it. But that general support and whole, when measures come up for tax increases, they're not there just because, you know, there's no need for it. There's always a need for it. And they can certainly be active in their communities with certainly the local jurisdictions and meaning by battalions about things like, you know, the brush clearing, for example, you know, being cooperative with that and realizing that the fire department doesn't want to do that to like mess up your house or make your life miserable. They're doing it for safety, for your safety, and the necessity to do that. That's one small area. You know, we all want to have our house look like we want it to, you know, how we want it, but we also could be creating a hazard for ourselves. I know I have pepper trees around my house. They're horrible. You know, we got to cut those things back. But I'm not in a super high fire danger, but you know, small things like that. And if anybody's interested in lobbying on a federal level for the departments for extra stuff, come on down. Let's get into it.
That's great.
On that, I don't think most people realize that federal firefighters, in particular, the U.S. Forest Service firefighters, make almost minimum wage, if not less than minimum wage.
Right.
I heard that last night.
And they're out there fighting fires and risking their lives to protect, property and life and everything else. So to Mike's point, please get out there and lobby for these folks that really need the help financially. There's no way you can do that job in Southern California on the wages that are offered and make it a sustainable thing. That's something that in Southern California in particular, we can't do without. Those folks in the ground doing that job is a vital part of this whole strategy in fighting wildland fires. There's a ton of interest, in the general community as it pertains to understanding and learning about what's happening in air operations, in particular in this fire. So thank you, Mike, for joining us and talking about this. And for the folks that are listening who may have been affected by the fire, who may have lost their house, just know that our heart goes out to you. We're praying for a positive outcome as a result of this, hoping some things change and the insurance companies come through and restore what was taken from you guys. Our heart breaks for you, and just want to let you know we support you. And to Jack and Mike, thank you guys again for joining us for this conversation. Is vitally important. And as we're recording, the last thing I'll say is getting notifications all over the place about this upcoming wind event that's starting or has started. Los Angeles Times just 16 minutes ago put out a headline. And the headline's the Weather Service issues its most severe fire warning for parts of LA as winds pick up. So, Mike, please be safe out there. We know you will. But look forward to seeing you in person. And cheers you and all the efforts of your coworkers over a beer here at HAI or somewhere soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to make one last, you touched on something. I've even felt them in my phone in my pocket while flying. They do issue, if an emergency alert comes out for an evacuation and you're in a mandatory evacuation versus a warning and or a voluntary evacuation, please take it seriously, right? It's there for a reason. And unfortunately or fortunately, it needs to be done in a timely manner. And they're given by virtue of what they perceive to be the threat and the threat area, trying to allow you as much time as possible to leave and get out, get some belongings, get the personal belongings, the things that you have that are very important to you. I personally, in my house, have most of the things that I really truly care about in a couple of different places. And I already talked to my son because we're in Ventura County and now the wind is going to shift up there. And I live in an area that if it started in the right place, could be very problematic about what to do if that happens. And, quite frankly, with the exception of a few things, it's just a house. I don't care. I mean, it would be bad, obviously, but it's not worth anything else. It's certainly not worth anybody in my family. And so those are important. And Paradise was unfortunately a bad situation that even though they had evacuation plan, it got kind of stifled. Here we pulled the trigger very early, almost immediately on Eaton. I know they tried to do it on the Palisades, and as soon as those areas started expanding, those alerts went out immediately. I think people at that point knew we got to abide by this. And think about it this way: it doesn't matter if you, and I heard one lady comment on the news, and she had said that she had been evacuated like almost every year or 3 other times, and just kind of said, well, I didn't really think that this time would be any different. Well, unfortunately, look at what had happened, right? So you don't lose anything other than some inconvenience in time by evacuating and having nothing happen. But you definitely can lose something if you don't heed it and God forbid the worst thing happens. So they've got we've got a much more robust communication system through the cell network, and that allows people that notification, but it needs to be taken seriously. So allowing the firefighters and others to get in there, law enforcement in there to do what they can do to protect as much as they can. Right. So that's the end goal.
Without a dozer having to push it offline. Jack, any last words?
No, just thank you again, Mike. Thanks for your time. Relax while you can and stay safe.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a long night, but that's okay.
Yep.
Good seeing you guys.
Good seeing you, Mike.
Well, thank you again for listening to the Hangar Z podcast. Thank you to Vertical and Vertical Valor for making this happen and making this possible. And we'll catch you later. Cheers.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Hangar Z podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories that promote the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Lastly, stand by for a message after a word from our sponsors. Cheers.
Thank you to our sponsor, Robinson Helicopter Company, the choice for unrivaled safety and reliability so you can accomplish any mission with confidence. For more than half a century, Robinson has been at the forefront of the helicopter industry. From the R-22 to the R-66 turbine, Robinson makes helicopters accessible so more people can accomplish more missions. Climb higher. For additional information, visit www.robinsonheli.com. You protect and defend. So do we. Astronautics' proven cybersecurity, connectivity, and upgrade solutions support helicopter OEMs and operators worldwide. When the mission matters, you need to trust that your avionics systems are secure, connected, and reliable because lives depend on it. Continue to protect and defend. So will we. Contact Astronautics at www.astronautics.com.
Thank you to our sponsor, Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 160-plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors. Thank you for joining us for this special episode of the Hangar Z podcast, covering the 2025 LA Firestorm. We're grateful to have had the opportunity to talk with LA County Fire Pilot Mike Sagely, who shared invaluable insights into the catastrophic wildfires that have dramatically impacted Los Angeles. As we discussed, the Palisades and Eaton fires have wreaked havoc, devastating communities, claiming lives, and threatening countless structures. The complexities described by Mike of fighting fires during such extreme conditions highlight the challenges airborne and ground-based firefighters face, from navigating treacherous terrain to responding to the ever-changing dynamics of wind and fire behavior. The emotional toll on those fighting these fires cannot be overstated, and it's clear how vital community support and public awareness are in these times of crisis. We hope today's conversation has provided a deeper understanding of the heroism and resilience demonstrated by our firefighting teams as they work tirelessly to protect lives and property. A special thanks to Vertical Helicast and Vertical Valor Magazine for bringing this episode to you. Stay tuned for more compelling discussions and insights in future episodes. Cheers.
Time to close up the hangar. Thanks for joining us on the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts.